What if I told you that somewhere, in the forgotten hollows of Appalachia, a piece of film exists that has never been shown to the public? A recording so deeply unsettling that the men who found it refused to speak about what they witnessed for over 30 years. This is not a ghost story. This is not fiction. This is a documented event, buried beneath decades of silence, institutional denial, and the quiet terror of those who stumbled upon something they could not explain. The footage you are about to learn about was captured in the autumn of 1973 in a region of eastern Kentucky so remote that even today parts of it remain unmapped. What the camera recorded was not a monster. It was not a demon. It was something far worse. It was a warning. A warning etched into the land itself, visible only to those who ventured too deep, who stayed too long, who ignored every instinct screaming at them to turn back. The men who found this footage were not paranormal investigators. They were federal surveyors, government employees sent to document terrain for a highway project that was never completed. What they brought back with them changed their lives forever. 2 of them never worked again. 1 disappeared entirely. And the footage itself was locked away in a county archive, misfiled, forgotten, until a records clerk discovered it in 2019 and made the mistake of watching it alone. By the end of this account, you will understand why this footage was hidden. You will understand why the land itself seemed to reject human presence, and you will understand why some warnings are not meant to be ignored. Stay until the very end, because the final revelation is the one that will stay with you long after this video ends. The year was 1973, and the hills of eastern Kentucky were undergoing a quiet transformation that most Americans never noticed. Federal funding had been allocated for a new highway corridor, a project designed to connect isolated communities in the heart of Appalachia to the broader economic networks of the nation. On paper, it was a promise of prosperity, of jobs, of connection. But to the people who lived in those hollows, people whose families had been rooted in that land for generations, the project felt less like a gift and more like an intrusion. The surveyors arrived in early October, a team of 4 men from the Army Corps of Engineers, accompanied by a documentary filmmaker named Harold Whitmore. Whitmore had been hired by the federal government to create promotional footage, material that would be used to sell the highway project to skeptical local communities. He was 42 years old, a veteran of similar assignments across the rural South, and he approached this job with the same professional detachment he had applied to every other. He had no idea that this assignment would be his last. The team set up their base camp near a small settlement called Bonner Hollow, a collection of wooden structures that clung to the sides of a narrow valley like moss on a fallen log. The people of Bonner Hollow were polite but distant. They answered questions with single words, avoided eye contact, and seemed to watch the surveyors with a mixture of curiosity and something that looked almost like pity. The team leader, a man named Thomas Greer, dismissed their behavior as typical mountain wariness. He had seen it before in other isolated communities, the suspicion of outsiders, the reluctance to engage. But Harold Whitmore noticed something else. He noticed that the people of Bonner Hollow never looked toward the ridge to the east. They oriented their bodies away from it, as if it were a presence they were deliberately ignoring. When he asked an elderly woman about the ridge, she simply shook her head and walked away. That night, sitting around the fire at base camp, Whitmore mentioned what he had observed. Thomas Greer laughed it off, attributing it to local superstition. But the youngest member of the team, a 24-year-old surveyor named Daniel Pruitt, did not laugh. He had grown up in West Virginia, just a few valleys over from this region, and he knew that mountain people did not ignore things without reason. He suggested they ask more directly, find someone willing to talk. Greer refused. They had a schedule to keep, and he was not about to waste time chasing folklore. The next morning, the team began their survey of the eastern ridge. They would spend 3 days in that terrain, mapping elevations, testing soil composition, documenting the landscape for the engineers who would eventually design the road. Harold Whitmore accompanied them, his camera capturing everything. What he recorded during those 3 days would become the footage that was later hidden, the footage that no one was supposed to see. The first day passed without incident. The terrain was difficult, steep and heavily forested, but nothing unusual. The men worked efficiently, marking trees, taking measurements, speaking little. Whitmore filmed the process, occasionally panning across the landscape to capture the beauty of the autumn foliage, the way the sunlight filtered through the canopy in golden shafts. But as the day wore on, he began to notice something strange about the light itself. It seemed to change quality as they moved deeper into the ridge, becoming flatter, grayer, as if the sun were being filtered through a layer of smoke that was not visible to the naked eye. He mentioned this to Greer, who attributed it to the weather, to the angle of the sun, to the thickness of the forest canopy. But Whitmore had spent years filming in forests across the American South, and he had never seen light behave quite like this. It was as if the landscape itself were absorbing brightness, pulling it inward, refusing to reflect it back. That night, they made camp on a small plateau near the top of the ridge. The temperature dropped rapidly as the sun set, and the men huddled around their fire, eating canned rations and speaking in low voices. Daniel Pruitt was the first to notice the silence. In the mountains, night was never truly quiet. There were always sounds, the calls of owls, the rustle of small animals, the distant bark of foxes. But here, on this ridge, there was nothing. The silence was so complete that it felt like a presence, something physical pressing against their eardrums. Pruitt stood up and walked to the edge of the firelight, staring into the darkness. He stayed there for a long time, not moving, not speaking. When he finally returned to the fire, his face was pale. He said he had heard something, not a sound exactly, but a sensation, like a pressure in his chest, like something was pushing against him from the inside. Greer told him he was imagining things, that the altitude and the cold were playing tricks on his mind. But Whitmore saw the fear in Pruitt's eyes, and he kept his camera close that night, ready to film at a moment's notice. The second day began with fog. A thick grey mist had settled over the ridge during the night, reducing visibility to less than 50 feet. The men delayed their departure, waiting for the fog to lift, but it did not. By mid-morning, Greer made the decision to proceed anyway. They had a schedule to keep, and a little fog was not going to stop them. This was a mistake. Moving through the fog, the team became disoriented almost immediately. Their compasses began to behave erratically, spinning slowly, pointing in directions that made no sense. Greer blamed it on mineral deposits in the rock, on magnetic anomalies common in mountain terrain. But even he seemed uncertain, checking his compass again and again, shaking it as if he could force it to work properly. Whitmore kept filming, documenting everything. His footage from that morning shows the men moving through a landscape that seems almost dreamlike, the trees looming out of the fog. Like dark sentinels, the ground covered in a carpet of dead leaves that made no sound beneath their boots. There is no audio in this section of the film, and when the footage was later analyzed, technicians could not explain why. The camera was functioning normally, the microphone was operational, but the recording captured nothing but silence. At approximately 11 in the morning, the team stumbled upon something that should not have been there. In a small clearing, surrounded by ancient oaks, they found the remains of a structure. It was not a cabin or a barn, nothing that could be easily identified. It was a framework of wooden beams, arranged in a pattern that seemed almost geometric, almost deliberate. but that conformed to no architectural style any of them recognized. The beams were old, weathered to a silver-grey color, covered in patches of lichen and moss. They had clearly been there for decades, perhaps longer. Greer approached the structure cautiously, examining it with the eye of an engineer. He noted that the beams were joined without nails or screws, fitted together with a precision that suggested advanced carpentry skills. But the pattern made no sense. It was not a foundation, not a support structure, not a framework for any building he could imagine. It was something else entirely, something that seemed to serve a purpose he could not comprehend. Whitmore filmed the structure from multiple angles, circling it slowly, capturing every detail. His footage shows the team standing in silence, staring at the framework, their faces reflecting a mixture of confusion and unease. Daniel Pruitt refused to approach it. He stayed at the edge of the clearing, his back pressed against a tree, his eyes fixed on the ground. When Greer called out to him, asking what was wrong, Pruitt did not answer. He simply shook his head, over and over, like a man trying to wake himself from a nightmare. The team spent nearly an hour at the clearing, examining the structure, taking measurements, trying to understand what they were looking at. Greer theorized that it was the remains of some kind of signal tower, perhaps built by settlers in the previous century. But the pattern of the beams did not support this theory. They were arranged in a way that suggested purpose, intention, meaning, but a meaning that remained completely opaque. It was Whitmore who noticed the carvings. As he circled the structure with his camera, he saw that some of the beams bore faint markings, symbols etched into the wood with a sharp instrument. The symbols were partially obscured by lichen, but he could make out enough to see that they were not letters, not numbers, not any form of writing he recognized. They were abstract shapes, curves and angles and spirals, arranged in sequences that seemed to follow some kind of internal logic. He filmed them in close-up, his camera lingering on each symbol, capturing every detail for later analysis. That analysis would never happen. The footage would be locked away before anyone could study it properly, but in the brief glimpses that later viewers would see, the symbols seemed to evoke a deep sense of unease, a feeling that they were looking at something that was not meant for human eyes. The team left the clearing around noon, continuing their survey of the ridge. But the discovery of the structure had changed the atmosphere of the expedition. The men spoke less, moved more cautiously, glanced over their shoulders more frequently. Even Greer, the most skeptical among them, seemed subdued, his earlier confidence replaced by a watchfulness that bordered on paranoia. The fog lifted in the early afternoon, and for a brief time the landscape seemed almost normal again. The sun broke through the clouds, casting long shadows across the forest floor. Birds could be heard in the distance, their calls faint but audible. The team made good progress, covering nearly 2 miles of terrain, documenting everything with their usual efficiency. But as the afternoon wore on, the light began to change again. It took on that same flat, grey quality that Whitmore had noticed the day before, as if the sun were being filtered through something invisible, something that absorbed its warmth and left only a pale, cold residue. And then, at approximately 4 in the afternoon, they found the second structure. This one was larger than the first, more complex, more elaborate. It stood in a natural amphitheater, a bowl-shaped depression in the mountainside surrounded by steep walls of rock. The framework filled the entire space, beams crisscrossing in patterns that seemed to defy logic, creating a web of wood that looked almost organic, almost alive. The men stood at the edge of the amphitheater, staring down at the structure, unable to speak. Whitmore's footage from this moment is among the most unsettling in the entire collection. The camera pans slowly across the framework, capturing its impossible geometry, its alien proportions. And then, for just a moment, the footage seems to distort. The image warps, bends, as if reality itself were being stretched and compressed. When it stabilizes, the men are gone. The camera is pointed at the empty amphitheater, the framework silent and still, and there is no sign of the team anywhere. This gap in the footage lasts approximately 7 minutes. When it resumes, the men are back at the edge of the amphitheater, but something has changed. Their faces are different, their expressions blank, their eyes unfocused. Daniel Pruitt is weeping silently, tears streaming down his cheeks, but his face shows no emotion at all. Greer is standing perfectly still, his hands at his sides, staring at nothing. The other 2 surveyors are sitting on the ground, their heads bowed, their shoulders shaking. And Harold Whitmore is behind the camera, still filming, his voice barely audible as he whispers the same phrase over and over, the same phrase that would later be transcribed by the records clerk who found the footage in 2019. He was saying, "It showed me, it showed me, it showed me." Check if you're already subscribed to this channel. If you have ever felt the pull of hidden history, if you have ever wondered what truths lie buried beneath the official record, then you need to be here for every revelation that follows. Subscribe now, because what comes next is something you will not find anywhere else. The team descended. From the ridge that evening, in complete silence, no one spoke about what had happened at the amphitheater. No one discussed the 7-minute gap in the footage, the blank expressions, the tears, the whispered repetition of those 3 words. They simply walked, 1 foot in front of the other, their eyes fixed on the path ahead, their minds somewhere else entirely. They reached base camp as the sun was setting, the sky turning a deep shade of purple that seemed to pulse with an inner light. The people of Bonner Hollow watched them arrive from the doorways of their homes, their faces unreadable, their silence absolute. Not a single person came forward to ask how the survey had gone. Not a single person offered assistance or hospitality. They simply watched, like witnesses to a funeral procession, like observers of something inevitable and tragic. Thomas Greer went directly to the radio equipment and tried to contact the regional office. The radio did not work. Static filled the frequency, a harsh, crackling noise that seemed to contain patterns, rhythms, almost like language. He tried for nearly an hour, adjusting frequencies, checking connections, but the result was always the same. The static, and beneath it, something that sounded almost like breathing. Harold Whitmore sat by the fire, his camera on his lap, his eyes staring into the flames. He had not spoken since they left the amphitheater, and when Daniel Pruitt approached him, asking if he was all right, Whitmore simply looked through him as if Pruitt were not there at all. The night passed slowly, each hour stretching into what felt like days. None of the men slept. They sat around the fire, feeding it logs, watching the flames, listening to the silence that pressed against them from all sides. The temperature dropped steadily, falling well below freezing by midnight, but none of them seemed to feel the cold. They were numb, in every sense of the word. At approximately 3 in the morning, Daniel Pruitt stood up and walked to the edge of the camp. He stood there for a long time, staring into the darkness, his body rigid, his hands clenched into fists. And then, without warning, he began to speak. His voice was low, monotone, devoid of emotion. He spoke about what he had seen in the amphitheater, what they had all seen, what the 7 minutes of missing footage could never capture. He spoke about the framework of beams, how it had seemed to shift and move as they watched, how the patterns had rearranged themselves into something that looked almost like a face, or a doorway, or a window into somewhere else. He spoke about the feeling that had washed over him, the certainty that he was being observed, that something was looking back at him through the gaps in the wood, something that knew him, that had always known him, that had been waiting for him to arrive. He spoke about the voice he had heard, not a sound exactly, but a pressure in his mind, a presence that communicated, without words, that showed him things he could not describe, things that existed outside the boundaries of human perception. And he spoke about the message, the warning, the reason the frameworks had been built in the first place. They were markers, he said, boundaries. They were not structures at all, but warnings, placed there by people who understood what lived in that part of the mountain, what had always lived there, what would continue to live there long after humanity was gone. The frameworks were a language, a way of saying do not enter, a way of communicating across generations, across centuries, across the vast gulf of time that separated the builders from those who came after. And the team had ignored the warning. They had crossed the boundary. They had entered the place that was not meant for human presence. And now something had noticed them. Something had marked them. Something would follow them wherever they went, for as long as they lived. Pruitt's voice trailed off, and he stood there in the darkness, his words hanging in the cold air like smoke. No one responded. No one moved. They simply sat there, around the fire, processing what he had said, trying to reconcile it with everything they thought they knew about the world. The next morning, the team packed their equipment and left Bonner Hollow without completing their survey. Thomas Greer filed a report stating that the terrain was unsuitable for highway construction, that the soil composition was unstable, that the project should be abandoned and the route relocated. His superiors accepted the report without question. The highway was never built. The ridge remained untouched, unmapped, forgotten. Harold Whitmore returned to his home in Virginia and locked the footage in a safe deposit box at his local bank. He never watched it again. He never spoke about what had happened on the ridge. He simply went on with his life, or tried to, spending his remaining years in a state of quiet, withdrawal that his family could never understand. He died in 1989, alone, in a hospital room in Roanoke. His personal effects included a journal that was filled with drawings of geometric patterns, frameworks of lines and angles that seemed to shift and move when you looked at them too long. The journal was destroyed by his family. They said it made them uncomfortable. They said it felt wrong to keep it. Thomas Greer retired from the Army Corps of Engineers in 1976, 3 years after the expedition. He moved to Florida, as far from the Appalachian mountains as he could get, and spent his remaining years fishing, gardening, and avoiding any conversation about his career. He died in 2003, never having spoken publicly about what happened on the ridge. His widow found a sealed envelope in his desk after his death. Inside was a single sheet of paper, covered in the same geometric symbols that Whitmore had filmed on the frameworks. There was no explanation, no context, no message, just the symbols, drawn in shaking handwriting, as if Greer had been trying to exorcise them from his memory. Daniel Pruitt disappeared in 1978. He left his apartment in Charleston, West Virginia, one evening and never returned. His car was found 3 days later, parked at the base of a mountain road in eastern Kentucky, less than 20 miles from Bonner Hollow. There was no sign of struggle, no indication of what had happened. To him, he simply vanished, as if the mountain had finally claimed what it had marked 5 years earlier. His case remains unsolved to this day. The other 2 members of the survey team, whose names have been withheld from public records, both died within a decade of the expedition. One was killed in a car accident in 1977. The other took his own life in 1981. Neither left any explanation, any note, any indication of what drove them to their fates. But those who knew them said they had changed after the trip, had become withdrawn, paranoid, haunted by something they could never articulate. The footage itself was recovered from Whitmore's safe deposit box after his death and transferred to a county archive in Virginia, where it was misfiled among a collection of promotional materials from the same era. It sat there untouched for 30 years, and then, in 2019, a records clerk named Margaret Chen was cataloguing the archive's holdings and came across the unmarked film canister. She threaded the film into a projector and watched it alone in the basement of the archive building, not knowing what she was about to see. What Margaret Chen witnessed in that footage would change her understanding of the world. She watched the survey team move through the fog-shrouded ridge, their faces tense, their movements cautious. She watched them discover the first framework, the strange geometric structure that seemed to serve no purpose. She watched them find the second structure, the massive web of beams that filled the amphitheater. And she watched the 7-minute gap, the distortion, the moment when reality seemed to bend and warp around the camera. When the footage resumed, she saw the blank faces, the silent tears, Harold Whitmore's whispered confession. She watched the entire thing, twice. And when she finished, she sat in the darkness of the archive basement for nearly an hour, unable to move. She later described the experience in a private journal that was discovered after her death. She wrote that the footage seemed to affect her physically, that she felt a pressure in her chest as she watched, a sensation of being observed from somewhere she could not see. She wrote that the symbols on the frameworks, visible in Whitmore's close-up shots, seemed to move when she looked at them, seemed to rearrange themselves into patterns that hurt to perceive. And she wrote that after watching the footage, she began to dream about the ridge, about the frameworks, about the amphitheater. She began to feel a pull, an urge to travel there, to see it for herself, to understand what the team had discovered. Margaret Chen died in 2020 of natural causes, according to the official report. She was 54 years old. She had never married, never had children, never formed close relationships with anyone after watching the footage. Her colleagues said she had become isolated in her final year, spending long hours alone in the archive, researching the history of eastern Kentucky, the settlements that had existed there, the people who had lived and died in those forgotten hollows. Her research files were extensive, and they painted a picture of a region that had been marked by tragedy for as long as anyone could remember. She had traced the history of Bonner Hollow back to the early 1800s, when a group of settlers from Virginia had established a small community in the shadow of the eastern ridge. Within a decade, the community had been abandoned. The settlers had simply left, walking away from their homes, their crops, their livestock, leaving everything behind. There were no records of where they went, no letters, no journals, no explanations. They simply disappeared into the mist of history, as if the mountain had swallowed them whole. If this story is making you question what you thought you knew about history, about reality, about the boundaries of human understanding, leave a comment right now with this phrase: "Some places were never meant to be found." I want to know how many of you are brave enough to confront this truth. Margaret Chen's research revealed that the settlers were not the first to abandon the ridge. Indigenous peoples had avoided the area for centuries, referring to it in oral traditions as a place of power, a boundary between worlds, a threshold that should never be crossed. The frameworks, she discovered, were far older than the 19th century. They had been built by unknown hands at an unknown time for a purpose that could only be guessed at. Some researchers she corresponded with believed they were astronomical markers designed to track the movements of stars and planets. Others thought they were religious structures, places of worship or sacrifice. But a few, a small minority who studied fringe archaeology and forbidden history, believed they were exactly what Daniel Pruitt had described on that cold night in 1973. They were warnings, boundaries, markers placed by people who understood something about that land, something about what lived there, something that modern science could not explain. And Margaret Chen, in the final months of her life, came to believe this theory was correct. She wrote in her journal that she had begun to perceive patterns in the world around her, connections that she had never noticed before. She wrote that she could feel the ridge calling to her, pulling at her consciousness, inviting her to return to a place she had never physically visited. She wrote that she understood, now, why the footage had been hidden, why the survey team had been silenced, why the highway had never been built. Some places, she wrote, exist outside the boundaries of human jurisdiction. Some places belong to something else. And when humans stumble into these places, when they cross the thresholds that were never meant to be crossed, they carry something back with them, something that marks them, changes them, claims them. Margaret Chen's journal was found in her apartment after her death, along with hundreds of pages of research notes, maps, photographs, and a single videotape. The videotape was a copy of the original footage, transferred from film to video by Margaret herself. When investigators reviewed the tape, they found that it was blank. The entire recording had been erased, replaced by static and silence. The original film, stored in the county archive, suffered the same fate. When archivists attempted to view it in 2021, they found that the footage had degraded beyond recovery. The images were gone, replaced by darkness and distortion. Some claimed it was natural deterioration, the inevitable decay of 50-year-old film stock. Others believed it was something else entirely. They believed the footage had served its purpose. It had been seen. It had spread. And now it was no longer needed. The warning had been delivered. The story of the Appalachian footage might have ended there, buried alongside Margaret Chen's research, forgotten like the survey team, erased like the film itself. But in the years that followed, something strange began to happen. People who had never seen the footage, who had never heard of Harold Whitmore or Thomas Greer or Daniel Pruitt, began to report experiences that echoed what the survey team had described. Hikers in the mountains of eastern Kentucky started encountering frameworks deep in the wilderness, geometric structures that appeared on no maps, that were not documented in any historical record. They photographed them, filmed them, shared the images online, asking if anyone knew what they were. The images spread across internet forums, dedicated to unexplained phenomena, to hidden history, to the strange and the unsettling. And those who viewed the images reported similar effects. A sense of unease, a feeling of being watched, dreams about mountains and mist and endless corridors of wooden beams. In 2022, a documentary filmmaker named Eric Vasquez traveled to eastern Kentucky to investigate the reports. He was a skeptic by nature, a debunker of myths and legends, and he expected to find a simple explanation for the frameworks, old mining structures perhaps, or the remains of logging operations, something mundane, something explicable. What he found was something else entirely. Vasquez spent 3 weeks in the mountains, hiking through terrain that grew increasingly difficult as he moved east, toward the ridge where the original survey team had conducted their expedition. He documented everything, filming constantly, recording his observations in a video diary that he intended to edit into a feature-length documentary. On the 17th day of his expedition, he found the amphitheater. It was exactly as Whitmore's footage had described it, a bowl-shaped depression surrounded by steep walls of rock, filled with a massive framework of wooden beams. The structure was larger than he had expected, more complex, more elaborate. It seemed to have grown since the original survey, or perhaps it had always been this size, and the earlier descriptions had simply failed to capture its true scale. Vasquez filmed for nearly 4 hours, circling the framework, examining it from every angle, recording every detail. He later described the experience in interviews as both terrifying and exhilarating. like standing at the edge of a revelation he could not quite grasp. He felt, he said, as if the structure were alive, as if it were aware of his presence, as if it were waiting for him to understand something that remained just beyond his comprehension. On the 20th day of his expedition, Eric Vasquez stopped filming. His final entry in his video diary shows him sitting at his campsite, his face pale, his eyes unfocused. He speaks slowly, choosing his words carefully, as if each one costs him effort. He says that he has seen something he cannot describe, that the framework showed him something, communicated with him in a way that bypassed language, bypassed thought, bypassed everything he understood about the nature of reality. He says that he understands now why the original footage was hidden. He says that some things are not meant to be shared, not because they are dangerous, but because they are true. And truths of that magnitude, he says, change everyone who encounters them. They cannot be unseen. They cannot be forgotten. They become part of you, woven into the fabric of your consciousness, shaping everything you think and feel and believe from that moment forward. Eric Vasquez returned from his expedition in November of 2022. He never completed his documentary. He never released the footage he had captured. He retreated from public life, refusing interviews, declining to discuss what he had experienced. Friends who spoke to him afterward said he had changed, had become distant, preoccupied, as if part of him were always somewhere else, always looking at something they could not see. In the spring of 2023, a team of researchers from a private university in Virginia organized an expedition to the Eastern Ridge. They were anthropologists, archaeologists, and folklorists, specialists in the study of vanished cultures and their artifacts. They had read the available accounts of the frameworks, had studied the photographs and videos that circulated online, and had concluded that the structures represented a significant archaeological find, perhaps the remains of an unknown indigenous civilization that had flourished in Appalachia long before European contact. The team consisted of 7 members, led by a professor named Dr. Sarah Moreau. She was 51 years old, a respected scholar with decades of experience in field research. She had explored sites in Central America, in Africa, in the Pacific Islands, and she approached this expedition with the same rigorous methodology she had applied to all her previous work. She had no interest in folklore or legend. She was interested only in facts, in evidence, in the tangible remains of human history. The expedition departed in early April, when the mountain roads were finally clear of snow. They established a base camp near the site of the original Bonner Hollow settlement, which had been reclaimed by the forest decades ago. Nothing remained of the community except a few stone foundations, barely visible beneath the undergrowth. The people who had lived there were gone, their descendants scattered, their history forgotten. The team spent the first week surveying the area, mapping the terrain, and searching for the frameworks that had been reported by hikers and explorers in recent years. They found nothing. The structures seemed to have vanished, or perhaps they had never been where the reports claimed. Dr. Moreau began to suspect that the stories were exaggerated, that the photographs were manipulated, that the entire phenomenon was a hoax perpetuated by people seeking attention or profit. But on the 8th day of the expedition, one of her team members, a graduate student named James Okoro, reported that he had found something. It was not a framework, not exactly. It was a clearing, a small open space in the forest where no trees grew, where the ground was covered in a thick mat of dead leaves that seemed to stretch back. Decades, perhaps centuries, and in the center of the clearing, barely visible beneath the leaves, was a pattern etched into the rock itself. The pattern was similar to the symbols that Harold Whitmore had filmed on the frameworks 50 years earlier, the same geometric shapes, the same curves and angles and spirals, arranged in sequences that seemed to follow some kind of internal logic. But there was something different about this pattern. It was not carved into wood. It was carved into stone. And the rock it was carved into was not native to the region. It was a type of granite that could only be found hundreds of miles away in the mountains of New Hampshire. Someone at some point in history had transported this massive stone to the heart of Appalachia and carved a message into its surface. A message that no one could read, a message that seemed to predate every known civilization that had ever inhabited the region. Dr. Moreau documented the discovery extensively, taking hundreds of photographs, making detailed measurements, collecting samples for laboratory analysis. She was excited, energized, convinced that she had stumbled upon something genuinely significant. She began to formulate theories about who might have created the pattern, when it might have been made, what purpose it might have served. She was still formulating these theories when her team began to experience the phenomena. It started with small things: compasses that did not work properly, watches that lost time, radio equipment that picked up strange frequencies, static that seemed to contain patterns, rhythms, almost like language. The team members attributed these anomalies to natural causes, to magnetic irregularities in the rock, to atmospheric conditions, to the altitude and the isolation. But the phenomena grew more pronounced as the days passed. Team members reported difficulty sleeping, plagued by dreams that they could not remember upon waking, dreams that left them feeling drained and disoriented. They reported headaches, nausea, a persistent sense of being watched. They reported hearing sounds in the forest that they could not identify, sounds that seemed to come from multiple directions at once, sounds that seemed to be moving closer. On the 15th day of the expedition, James Okoro disappeared. He had gone to collect water from a stream approximately half a mile from camp, and he did not return. The team searched for him for 3 days, covering every inch of the surrounding terrain, calling his name until their voices were hoarse. They found no trace of him. It was as if he had simply ceased to exist, as if the forest had absorbed him, as if the mountain had claimed another victim. Dr. Moreau made the decision to abort the expedition. She gathered her remaining team members, packed their equipment, and began the long descent from the ridge. They moved quickly, driven by fear that none of them would admit, by a growing certainty that they had overstayed. Their welcome in a place that did not want them there. They reached civilization 3 days later, exhausted, traumatized, and fundamentally changed by what they had experienced. The expedition's findings were never published. The photographs of the carved stone, the measurements, the samples, all of it was classified by the university and locked away in a secure archive. Dr. Moreau was advised not to discuss what had happened, not to give interviews, not to write about the experience in any form. She complied, but the silence cost her. She resigned from her position 6 months later, citing personal reasons. She moved to a small town in the Pacific Northwest and never returned to academic work. James Okoro's disappearance was investigated by local authorities, but the case was closed after a few months due to lack of evidence. His family was told that he had likely suffered an accident in the wilderness, that his body would probably never be found. They were not told about the strange phenomena the team had experienced, about the carved stone, about the patterns that seemed to affect anyone who spent too long in that place. They were told only that their son was gone, and that they would never know why. The footage that Harold Whitmore captured in 1973 was gone, erased, degraded beyond recovery. But the story it told refused to die. It had spread like a virus, like a seed carried on the wind, taking root in the minds of everyone who encountered it. The hikers who found the frameworks, the researchers who studied the carved stone, the filmmakers and journalists who tried to document the phenomenon, the internet users who shared photographs and theories and speculation, all of them became carriers of the message, transmitters of the warning. whether they understood it or not, and the frameworks themselves continued to appear. New sightings were reported every year in different locations, in different states, as if the structures were multiplying, spreading outward from their original source in the heart of Appalachia. Some researchers believed the frameworks had always been there, hidden in plain sight, and that people were only now learning to see them. Others believed they were being built actively and deliberately by hands unknown, for purposes that remained opaque. A few believed they were not physical structures at all, but manifestations of something else, something that existed outside the boundaries of normal perception, something that only became visible when the conditions were right, when the observer was in the proper state of mind, when the veil between worlds had grown thin enough to see through. This brings us to the final piece of the puzzle, the revelation that Margaret Chen discovered in her final months of research, the truth that she wrote about in her journal, but never shared with anyone else. She believed she had found the origin of the frameworks, the source from which all the others had spread. It was not a physical location, not a specific site that could be found on a map. It was something older, something deeper, something that had existed in Appalachia long before humans had ever set foot on the continent. The land itself, she wrote, was alive. Not alive in the way we understand the word, not in the biological sense, not in any sense that science could measure or quantify, but alive in a way that the indigenous peoples had understood, that the early settlers had sensed, that everyone who spent time in those mountains eventually came to feel. There was a presence in the hills, a consciousness, an awareness that predated humanity by millions of years. It was not evil, not in any moral sense. It simply existed, following its own logic, pursuing its own purposes, interacting with the human world in ways that seemed incomprehensible to us, but that made perfect sense to it. The frameworks were its language, its way of communicating with the human visitors who stumbled into its domain. They were warnings, yes, but they were also invitations. They were saying, "This is our place. You are welcome to visit, but you may not stay. You may not claim this land as your own. You may not dig and drill and pave and build. You may not disturb what sleeps here." And those who ignored the warning, those who crossed the boundary, those who stayed too long or delved too deep, they were marked. Not harmed, not killed, not punished in any conventional sense, but marked, changed, claimed. They became part of the mountain's memory, woven into its consciousness, carried with it through the long ages of geological time. This was what happened to Daniel Pruitt, who disappeared in 1978. This was what happened to James Okoro, who vanished from the expedition in 2023. This was what happened, in some sense, to everyone who encountered the frameworks and could not forget them, who dreamed about them, who felt their pull across thousands of miles, who understood in some deep and wordless part of their being that they had been touched by something they could not explain. Margaret Chen's final journal entry was dated 3 weeks before her death. She wrote that she had made her decision. She was going to the ridge, to the amphitheater, to the place where the original footage had been captured. She was going to cross the boundary that Harold Whitmore and his team had crossed 50 years earlier. She was going to offer herself to the mountain, to the presence that lived there, to the consciousness that had been calling to her ever since she watched the footage in the basement of the archive. She was not afraid, she wrote. She understood now that fear was irrelevant. What waited for her on the ridge was not something to be feared. It was something to be accepted, embraced, surrendered to. It was the truth that humanity had been running from since the beginning of history, the truth that science had tried to bury, that religion had tried to explain away, that philosophy had tried to rationalize into meaninglessness. The truth was this: we are not alone. We have never been alone. And the things that share this world with us are not distant or hidden or supernatural. They are here, right here, in the rocks and the trees and the water and the air, watching us, waiting for us, patient beyond all human comprehension. Margaret Chen's body was found in her apartment, in her bed, looking peaceful. The official cause of death was heart failure. But when the investigators searched her belongings, they found that her car was missing. It was found 3 days later, parked at the base of a mountain road in eastern Kentucky, less than 20 miles from Bonner Hollow, less than 20 miles from the ridge, the same road where Daniel Pruitt's car had been found 45 years earlier. There was no sign of Margaret Chen at the scene, no footprints, no belongings, no indication that she had ever been there. Just the car, sitting empty in the morning mist, as if waiting for its owner to return from a journey that had no ending. The footage that felt like hell without fire, the warning that was caught on camera, the truth that was buried for 50 years, and then refused to stay buried. It is all connected, all part of the same story, the same message, the same ancient and patient truth. The mountains of Appalachia are not empty. They have never been empty, and those who venture into their depths, who ignore the warnings, who cross the boundaries that were set long before humanity existed, they do not always come back, and when they do come back, they are not the same. They carry something with them, something that changes them, something that marks them for the rest of their lives. This is the story of the Appalachian footage. This is the warning that was captured on camera, and this is the truth that will stay with you long after this video ends, long after you close your eyes and try to sleep, long after you tell yourself that it was just a story, just words, just a tale told in the darkness. If you watched until here, it is because you could handle the truth. Leave a comment saying, "I watched until here," so I can know who truly follows these stories. And if this account moved you, disturbed you, made you question what you thought you knew about the world, then subscribe to this channel for more revelations from the hidden corners of history. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it, someone who is ready to confront the truths that most people prefer to ignore. And leave a like, because every like tells us that you want more stories like this, more explorations of the darkness that exists at the edges of human knowledge. The mountains are watching, the frameworks are waiting, and the warning will continue to spread, carried by everyone who encounters it until the day when humanity finally learns to listen. The ridges of eastern Kentucky still stand, silent and patient, draped in mist that never quite lifts, touched by a light that never quite reaches the forest floor. The frameworks are still there, hidden in the deep hollows, in the amphitheaters carved by ancient water, in the clearings where no trees grow. They are waiting, as they have always waited, for the next visitor, the next witness, the next carrier of the warning. And somewhere, in the vast and ancient consciousness that inhabits those hills, the memories of Harold Whitmore and Daniel Pruitt and Margaret Chen and James Okoro live on, woven into the fabric of the mountain itself, part of a story that has no beginning and no end, a story that will continue long after every human voice has fallen silent, long after every camera has stopped recording, long after every warning has been forgotten and rediscovered and forgotten again. This is the truth of Appalachia. This is what the footage revealed. And this is what will stay with you, whether you want it to or not, for the rest of your days. The camera that Harold Whitmore used to film the survey expedition was found in his estate after his death, stored in a cardboard box in his attic alongside other equipment from his career. It was a Bell & Howell 16mm camera, a professional model, popular among documentary filmmakers of that era. When investigators examined it, they found that the film compartment was empty. But they also found something else, something that no one could explain. The interior of the camera was covered in a fine layer of dust, grey and slightly metallite, that did not match any substance in Whitmore's home. Laboratory analysis revealed that the dust was composed of organic compounds, minerals, and trace elements that were consistent with soil samples from a very specific region, the mountains of eastern Kentucky, the ridge where Whitmore had filmed, the place where the framework stood. Somehow, impossibly, particles from that distant location had found their way into the camera, had settled there, had remained there for decades, as if the camera itself had brought something back from that place, had carried a piece of the mountain with it across time and space. The camera was destroyed after the analysis was complete. The investigator who had ordered the analysis, a forensic scientist named Dr. Patricia Webb, requested that it be incinerated and the ashes disposed of in a manner that would prevent any possibility of recovery. Her request was granted. When asked later why she had ordered the destruction, Dr. Webb declined to comment, but colleagues who knew her said she had seemed different after handling the camera, more withdrawn, more anxious, prone to staring at nothing for long periods of time. She retired from forensic work a year later and moved to a coastal town in Maine, as far from the mountains as she could get. She never spoke about the camera again. She never spoke about much of anything again. The story continues to spread. It spreads through internet forums and documentary films and whispered conversations in the dark. It spreads through the dreams of those who have encountered the frameworks, who have seen the photographs, who have watched the testimonies of witnesses and survivors. It spreads like the patterns on the beams themselves, like the symbols carved into the stone, like a language that bypasses conscious thought and speaks directly to something deeper, something older, something that recognizes the warning even when the mind cannot understand it. There are those who believe that the spread is intentional, that the consciousness in the mountains is using human communication networks to extend its reach, to touch minds that would never physically travel to those remote hollows. They believe that every person who hears the story becomes in some sense a carrier, a node in a vast network of awareness that the mountain is building slowly, patiently, across decades and centuries. And there are those who believe something even stranger. They believe that the frameworks are not warnings at all, not boundaries, not markers of forbidden territory. They believe that the frameworks are doors, thresholds, passages to somewhere else, somewhere that exists outside the geography we know, outside the time we measure, outside the reality we inhabit. They believe that Daniel Pruitt and James Okoro and all the others who have disappeared did not die, did not suffer, did not meet tragic ends. They believe that these people stepped through the doorways, crossed the thresholds, and found themselves somewhere else, somewhere that the human mind cannot imagine, somewhere that the frameworks were designed to reveal. This theory is impossible to prove or disprove. The disappeared leave no trace, no evidence, no testimony that could confirm or deny what happened to them. They simply vanish, like smoke in the wind, like dreams upon waking, like memories that fade until you can no longer be certain they were ever real. But those who have studied the phenomenon, who have spent years researching the frameworks and the footage and the testimonies of survivors, they say that the theory fits. It explains why the people who vanish seem at peace, seem ready, seem almost eager to cross over. It explains why the frameworks inspire not just fear, but also fascination, not just dread, but also longing. It explains why the warning feels to some like an invitation, and it explains why the story will never stop spreading, why the footage will never be truly lost, why the truth of those ancient mountains will continue to find its way into human consciousness, generation after generation, until the end of time. The Appalachian footage that felt like hell without fire was never meant to be a story of horror. It was meant to be a story of truth, a truth that is difficult to accept, that challenges everything we think we know about the nature of reality, that demands a fundamental shift in how we understand our place in the universe. We are not the masters of this world. We are not alone in its vastness. And the things that share this planet with us are not distant or dormant or defeated. They are here, now, watching, waiting, remembering. The frameworks are their language, the warnings are their gift, and the choice, as it has always been, is ours. We can heed the warnings. We can respect the boundaries. We can acknowledge that there are places we are not meant to go, truths we are not meant to know, doorways we are not meant to cross, or we can ignore them as so many have before. We can push forward, driven by curiosity, by ambition, by the human compulsion to know, to understand, to conquer. And if we do, we will become part of the story. Our names will join the list of those who ventured too deep, stayed too long, crossed the threshold that was never meant to be crossed. And the mountain will remember us, as it remembers all who have come before, as it will remember all who come after. This is the warning. This is the truth. This is the story that will stay with you long after the screen goes dark, long after the sound fades into silence, long after you tell yourself it was just a story, just words, just a creation of imagination and artifice. Because somewhere in the hills of eastern Kentucky, the frameworks stand patient and still, waiting for the next visitor, the next witness, the next carrier of the message. And the mist that hangs over the ridges is watching, always watching, with eyes that have seen the rise and fall of civilizations, the birth and death of species, the long, slow march of geological time. It is watching you, right now, through the screen, through the words, through the strange and nameless connection that binds all consciousness together. And it is waiting to see what you will do with the warning you have received.